5 years ago, we had Dr. Benn Steil here for our program in May of 2018 on the Marshall Plan. Anybody here alive during that program that recalls it, besides myself? Don, okay, first row. So we've got a couple of hands. Dynamic program. And, it's one of those kind of things that Don does where it's like, okay, we're doing World War II, but we're not confined to just World War II. We have an expansive aura where we go into environments that were shaped by World War II, which with the Marshall Plan, we had 5 folks that had different experiences during that. Of course, we were in the bomb shelter over at Fort Snelling that many moons ago. But it was a delight. What I found very attractive about how Dr. Steil writes, I almost said Dr. Stein, sorry about that. I might make another slip up on that. But Dr. Steil writes in a way where he takes a massive, complicated, industrial level thing like economics, like the Marshall Plan or Bretton Woods, and he's able to weave in those personal stories where you have touch points and you get to feel that you know some of the characters that are in this play, not just this massive subject that may seem hard to pass at some time without laxative. But besides that particular point, Dr. Steil is widely acclaimed. He's a writer and speaker on financial issues and economic issues. He attained his degrees from Oxford in economics, his master's and his PhD. And he is also writing another book that we hope to have him back for, and that's on Henry Wallace. Sometime in the near future or far future, whenever the book is finished and published and out there, we would like to have him back. In his current role at the Council on Foreign Relations out in New York, he is the sitting economic senior director, I believe, to some of us that get his newsletter. It's always fascinating, especially looking at the world today and seeing all the economic easing and all the different things that are happening. And it's fascinating. So we're going to take a trip back to Bretton Woods. So 1944, here we come. Ring, ring, the new phone. With no further ado, Dr. Steil.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Don. It is a real, genuine pleasure and an honor to be invited back to, particularly to deliver the Deutsch lecture. The talk I did here in 2018, Hand Over Heart, was the most fun I ever had on a book talk evening ever. I mean, the work you do here is just magnificent. Don, Connie, Mark. I remember that evening vividly, your veterans engagement, the student outreach. I'm on the board of an organization in New York called the New York Military Affairs Symposium, and I'm always telling them, you gotta look at what they're doing in Minnesota. So programming is unbelievable. The website is great. Look how they get the students involved. It's really a testimony to your remarkable work here. So thank you so much for having me back. And thank you to you all for coming out on a rainy election eve. I sincerely hope that all your candidates won or at least came in second place. Bretton Woods. Why Bretton Woods? Bretton Woods is, as Mark is saying, my background is as an economist, but after writing this book, I started writing on Cold War history. Within a half an hour, you'll understand exactly why. It started with this story. Bretton Woods is a story I decided I wanted to try to tell back in 2009 as the financial crisis was spreading globally. And you had world leaders from British Prime Minister Gordon Brown to French Prime Minister Nicolas Sarkozy, all calling for, quote unquote, a new Bretton Woods. But I couldn't help but notice that there'd been virtually nothing written about the old original one. There was dry as dust stuff written about the so-called Bretton Woods International Monetary System and the institutions that came out of it, but really nothing about the episode. And it turned out to be far more fascinating than I had realized. We economists are taught in grad school. There's an old joke about a student walking with his professor, and he says, "Professor, there's $20 on the ground." And the economics professor says, "Don't be ridiculous. If there were $20 on the ground, someone would have picked it up." But there was really $20 on the ground. There was a fascinating story to be told. It was career-changing for me. As you'll see, this is a genuinely interesting Cold War story that then got me interested in the Marshall Plan. I dug through Russian archives to write that book, became even more obsessed, and now, as Mark mentioned, I'm finishing a political biography of Henry Wallace, again a fascinating Cold War story, all starting with Bretton Woods. So let's get right into Bretton Woods. What is Bretton Woods? The Bretton Woods International Monetary Conference is the most important international gathering since the Paris Peace Talks of 1919, 25 years earlier. So this takes place over the course of 3 weeks in July of 1944. There are over 700 delegates from 44 allied nations. Now, why was this remote spot chosen, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire? Well, one reason, have any of you here ever been to the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods? It's a spectacular hotel. It's a spectacular place. It's marvelous for skiing and so on. FDR wanted to sort of lock the delegates up in the mountains someplace really remote where they wouldn't be able to escape and pay attention to other things. It was so remote that a group of the Chinese delegates were hiking through the mountains, and they were shot at, literally shot at, by a hermit who thought they were Japanese invaders. But the reason FDR chose Bretton Woods was because he vividly remembered President Wilson's failure after World War I to get the League of Nations passed in the Senate. So he was determined to bring along the Republicans, and one of his ways of doing that was to help out one of the Republican senators in New Hampshire, Charles Tobey, who was known as an isolationist, who was facing a difficult primary campaign. And he figured if he gave him a big international conference, he would become an internationalist and bring along his Republican colleagues. And that is exactly what happened. So President Roosevelt was very astute in that regard. So let's put the timing in perspective here. This is really quite important. This is only a few weeks after the D-Day landings at Normandy. So the delegates who are at the conference really feel that this is an important event because it's sort of the beginning of the end of the war. The end is in sight, and post-war planning is now taking on a real meaning. That is that their deliberations could really have a significant impact on the evolution of the world. President Roosevelt attached enormous political significance to this event. He didn't give a damn about the economics. In fact, he was very skeptical about the whole concept of international economic cooperation. He single-handedly destroyed the 1933 London Economic Conference by delivering this dyspeptic message talking about international monetary coordination as being, quote unquote, a fetish of international bankers. But he was convinced by his Treasury Secretary, we'll get into him in a moment, that this could have enormous political significance, perhaps even bring the war to an earlier conclusion by sending a message to the enemy Axis powers that it was the United States and the Allies who had the positive vision for the post-war world. Unfortunately, his Treasury Secretary did quite a bit to delay the ending of the war. Some of you may know about the so-called Morgenthau Plan, named for this man, Henry Morgenthau. This was the plan to dismember and deindustrialize Germany, which, thank goodness, was overthrown with the Marshall Plan, to go back to my last talk. here. So Henry Morgenthau, who was he? He was President Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary going back to 1934. What were his qualifications for the job? Well, not many. He was a sort of gentleman apple farmer. Intellectually, he wasn't really the sharpest tack in the box. He certainly knew nothing about economics. There's this story I love about this prominent New York Democratic Party donor who, when she heard that Roosevelt planned to make Henry Morgenthau, of all people, Treasury Secretary, said, "I can't believe this. Roosevelt managed to find the only Jew in America who knows nothing about money." Now, she could get away with it because she herself was Jewish, but Morgenthau truly knew nothing about economics. He was an old friend of FDR's from Hyde Park, New York, but Morgenthau really thought of this event as being sort of the crowning achievement of his career, but he had no idea what to do with it. He certainly knew very little about economic policy, so he was dependent on this man, Harry Dexter White, who was his deputy but had no official civil service title at the U.S. Treasury. He was effectively a bureaucratic temp going back to 1933, which is where Morgenthau liked to keep him because he didn't want this guy to get credit for all his policy innovations that he, Henry Morgenthau, would take up to the president. So Harry Dexter White is truly one of the most fascinating American political figures of the 20th century that nobody knows anything about. For now, you'll have to take my word for it, but within about 15 minutes, you'll understand why. So Harry Dexter White is, unlike the president, he's very wedded to this idea of international economic monetary coordination. He's very much an economic determinist in how he explains the Second World War. White believed that it was Britain's exit from the so-called gold exchange standard in 1931 that spread the Great Depression globally by triggering a series of currency and trade wars. And he believed that this created the environment of misery and anger that paved the way to path to aggression for Hitler and Mussolini. So he's quite determined for many, many years to put together a conference like this. There had been in the 30s a number of efforts at monetary stabilization. There was a so-called tripartite agreement in 1936 among the US, the UK, and France to stabilize exchange rates. That lasted about 18 months. In 1935, Henry Morgenthau successfully bludgeoned the Chinese to, and this is not a mistake, peg their currency to the US dollar. Now, we've been yelling at the Chinese for about 15 years now to depeg their currency from the US dollar. Why was it different in the 1930s? Well, in the 1930s, all the pressure on the US dollar was upwards. China was pegging their currency to sterling, which was declining, and we wanted a more competitive dollar, so we bludgeoned the Chinese to peg their currency to the dollar. Fast forward to today, and it tends to be the opposite. The pressure in the early 2000s, of course, was on China's currency to appreciate. China's keeping it down. This is bad for a competitive dollar, so we bludgeon the Chinese to depeg their currency. So that's our consistency there. We always seem to want a weaker dollar. The other major player in this drama is Great Britain, represented by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill famously referred to American Lend-Lease aid during World War II as quote unquote, the most unsorted act. A lot of people mistakenly attach that, that phrase to the Marshall Plan. It was actually about American Lend-Lease aid. But Churchill was actually painfully aware that American Lend-Lease aid came with geopolitical strings attached, which were very, very painful for Britain to bear. And there were three of them in particular. One, the US Treasury Department was demanding that Britain, after the war, abandon what was called imperial trade preference. This was the arrangement by which Britain gave itself privileged access to the markets of its colonies and dominions. This was anathema to the United States, both commercially and politically. And so that had to be done away with. Second, the United States wanted Britain to, once again, after the war, make its currency fully convertible into US dollars at a fixed, overvalued exchange rate. That eventually came to pass in July of 1947. It basically marked Britain's descent into complete bankruptcy because all its creditors were lined up at the door waiting to cash in their worthless sterling for dollars. So for the British, a day that would live in infamy. So Churchill knew what was coming from this demand. And third, that the British should basically accept the US dollar as the dominant international currency to finance trade and financial transactions, replacing the pound sterling. And so these two aims come together at Bretton Woods. On the one hand, the belief that there needed to be formal international cooperation in the monetary sphere in order so that we not repeat the tragedy of the 1930s, but also that we take advantage of Britain's problems to eliminate them as an economic and political rival. And this comes across particularly nicely in Harry Dexter White's opening instructions to the American delegation at Bretton Woods. White, again, at Bretton Woods, just like within the Treasury Department, has no formal title within the delegation. He masterminded the whole conference as a kabuki play, literally a kabuki play. It's completely scripted for the 3 weeks. And the machinations that he devises to enshrine the US dollar as the dominant currency in the international architecture are truly remarkable. I won't spend time on it now, but you really, I think, enjoy it in the book. But most of the US delegates are not experts on monetary affairs. 4 of them, for example, are congressmen, 2 Republican, 2 Democrat. And White's explaining to them what this is all about. And he says it's gold in Fort Knox. That is the reason why the US is, and I'm quoting him, in such a powerful position at this conference. It is why we dominate the financial world. If only England was in this position, it would be a very different story. So this is the power play. Harry Dexter White, throughout his time in Washington, going back to the early 30s, is absolutely obsessed with the relative geopolitical positions of the United States and Great Britain. Going through his archives, for example, which are at Princeton University, I found this fascinating document in 1936 where he is essentially describing Bretton Woods. And he's planning this international conference at which he, Harry Dexter White, will best the British Empire. And he writes in this document, quote unquote, the more sterling countries there are in the world, that is, countries that use the pound sterling or peg to the pound sterling, the stronger will be England's position around a conference table should an international conference take place. So he's preparing for the right moment at which to launch a conference like this where we can knock the pound sterling off its perch. As for Henry Morgenthau, again, he didn't know anything about international monetary affairs, but he told President Truman after FDR dies in 1945 what his aim was at Bretton Woods. He said, I wanted, quote unquote, to move the financial center of the world from London and Wall Street to the United States Treasury. Note the "and Wall Street" part. Okay, this is not just a matter of knocking off the British, but taking power away from Wall Street and transferring it to the US government. This is a New Deal agenda, sort of bringing back the New Deal. Roosevelt had forgotten about it, but Henry Morgenthau is bringing back more power to the state. Now, the British are not naive. They understand what this is about. So why do they go along with it? Well, as British delegate and famous economist in his own right, Lionel Robbins, you see him on the left here at Bretton Woods, how did he put it? He said, quote unquote, we needed the cash. It was really that simple. They went to Bretton Woods because they needed the cash. They needed to survive the war, and so they would have to enter into this Faustian bargain with the United States. Now let me talk a bit about the two great personalities at the conference. First, the head of the British delegation is the great British economist John Maynard Keynes. At Bretton Woods, he really invented the role of the celebrity international economist. I mean, today we're used to characters like Paul Krugman and Nouriel Roubini and Larry Summers jetting around the world with the media waiting on their next pronouncement. But he really created this role at Bretton Woods. The American media was utterly fascinated with Keynes. They didn't like him at all, but he was eminently quotable. And Morgenthau and White were just determined to bury this guy at Bretton Woods. They were really angry about it because the American media was characterizing the American Treasury team as basically Bush League compared to this guy. Why can't you talk like him? You know, he's come to bamboozle us, and these are the guys you send. Harry what? Harry Dexter White? Who are these people here? And they were so concerned about Keynes taking over Bretton Woods that they would not even allow Keynes to nominate Morgenthau to be president of the conference. They were afraid of letting him anywhere near a microphone. That's how concerned they were about him. Harry Dexter White created two major commissions at the conference to script the agenda. One was to create the IMF, which is all the US cared about because that was really the foundation of the new international monetary system. The other one was a commission to create the World Bank, which the US didn't give a damn about. So they handed that over to Keynes. And all the really nasty stuff to enthrone the dollar, that took place on Harry Dexter White's commission, and they made Keynes sign the documents as he was being forced to check out of the hotel. He even complained about it later that he didn't have time to read the stuff. But Keynes understood the US agenda very well. This is how he put it to his own government. He warned the British government of the need to, quote unquote, guard against the present emergency being used as an opportunity for picking out the eyes of the British Empire and to prevent Britain, quote unquote, becoming a satellite of the United States. He said there were quarters in the United States intending to use the grant of post-war credits to us as an opportunity for imposing upon the world the American conception of the international economic system. So he knows what's going on, but he plays the game. And why does he play the game? A lot of prominent British civil servants were very much against Britain going to Bretton Woods. And in fact, I found in the archives really rather fascinating that in May of 1944, just before the conference, a group of New York bankers offered the British financial secretary in Washington a deal. $3 billion of concessionary loans if the British would refuse to go to Bretton Woods. And the financial secretary was really interested in this deal. And Keynes said, no, we're going to Bretton Woods. And why? And my view is that Keynes, interesting combination there, Keynes the brains, wanted to use this conference to cement his own personal legacy as the man who overthrew the wretched gold standard and replaced it by a new rational system. Now, he knew very well that it was going to be White's system that emerged at Bretton Woods and not his, but he was quite convinced that his system was so superior that the world would quickly see sense and adopt his view. But partly he did win. I mean, if you go to the IMF today, you'll see a bust of John Maynard Keynes as if he created this whole thing. In fact, his intellectual contribution was very small, but he actually had 2 years of brutal personal fights with Harry Dexter White before the Bretton Woods conference. 95% of what was decided at the conference was decided between the United States and Great Britain in the 2-year run-up to the conference, and 95% of that was dictated by the United States. And Keynes, with all his brilliance, is actually the world's worst diplomat. Because when faced with a choice between persuading his opponent to adopt his position or humiliating his opponent, he would always choose to humiliate him. Always, every time. He simply couldn't control himself. That was his personality. And he often got far less than the British deserved because he was absolutely unwilling to concede anything or to even be gracious. Now, putting them together with Harry Dexter White it's just a wonderful story, a clash of the titans. They come from 2 entirely different backgrounds. John Maynard Keynes, the son of 2 upper middle class British academics. He was raised by a governess and servants. He's expected to go on to great things in life. Harry Dexter White, who was 9 years his younger, is the son of the youngest of 7 children of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants. He grows up in working class Boston. His father is a hardware peddler. His parents die when he's very young. He actually drops out of school in his first attempt to get a degree to go back into the family hardware business. But he eventually gets his degree, his PhD from Harvard. He's a smart guy. And if you read his Who's Who entry, for him, his life starts at Harvard. That's the beginning of his life. He's already in his 30s when he gets to Harvard, but nothing exists for White before he gets to Harvard. But he used to get physically sick before he would go into negotiations with Keynes because he didn't want to be humiliated in front of his colleagues. And the bust-ups between the two are legendary. My favorite one is in October of 1943. This is how Keynes characterizes White. He says, and I'm quoting, "He has not the faintest conception of how to behave or to observe the rules of civilized discourse." He referred to his blueprint for the IMF and World Bank as, quote unquote, the work of a lunatic or some sort of bad joke. So the 2 of them meet in 1943. White presents Keynes with his newest draft for the World Bank. Keynes takes it and hurls it onto the floor and yells, and I'm quoting him again, "This is intolerable. It is yet another Talmud." And Talmud, of course, is a reference to White being Jewish. Whenever Keynes would get riled up, it was always some little anti-Semitic barb. And White gave as good as he got and said back to him, "I apologize," he said, and I'm quoting, "We will try to produce something which your highness can understand." But what was the substance of the debate between these 2 guys? It wasn't all about personality. They were arguing substance. So let me go through some of the major differences between the US and the British position at Bretton Woods. White was seeking to create a new international monetary system fundamentally based on the dollar. People refer to it often as a gold standard. It's not the gold standard like in the late 19th century when central banks had really very little leeway to conduct policy. When gold came into the country, interest rates were pushed down. When gold left the country, interest rates were pushed up. Harry Dexter White had no time for that. But in 1944, the US controls 2/3 of the world's monetary gold stock. So it was easy to call this a gold standard. It's really a dollar standard. And Harry Dexter White just gives the world a promise that you will always be able to convert a dollar into gold at $35 an ounce. He says it's inconceivable that this promise could ever be broken, and if it were broken, he said the US dollar would collapse. Nobody would use it. 1971, of course, President Nixon closes the gold window, and here we are still living in a dollar-based world. But White did win in the sense that, yes, he enthroned the dollar. He gave it special status within the IMF that made it as good as gold. In other words, countries could use it to get IMF services, concessions, just as if they had gold. Keynes, now if he could have preserved the pound sterling as a dominant international currency, would have. He knew that was impossible. So what he was trying to do was create a new international currency, which he was going to call Bancor, which he hoped would eventually supplant the US dollar. Needless to say, the US had no time of day for this. The Americans were determined to stop countries from devaluing their currency against the US dollar. So under White's plan, countries would need permission from the IMF in order to devalue their currency. Under Keynes' plan, countries would have to actually devalue or revalue according to a formula. So this would all be given in a mathematical formula. There would be no discretion. White wanted the IMF to be a very strong institution run by well-paid technocrats who would really have enormous power over the member countries' economic policy, whereas Keynes wanted the IMF to be a passive institution, basically just an ATM for debtor nations. You got into trouble, you went to the IMF, and you took out your cash. He didn't want it to be a powerful institution at all. You might ask, well, why would the United States want the IMF to be powerful? Because then the IMF could dictate to the United States. White took care of that. Only one country would have veto power within the IMF. So the way and it's not called veto power within the Articles of Agreement. It was said that in order to pass something at the IMF, you had to have 85% of the voting rights. And the United States was the only country that had more than 15%. So it could veto anything. And when Congress grilled him after the conference, how could you sign up to this? They're going to dictate to us. They're going to make us do this, and they're going to make us do that. He said, anytime you get a report from the IMF, you can read it and give it due consideration and throw it straight in the bin. He actually said that before Congress, because we can veto anything. Quotas at the IMF. This dictated how much you could borrow from the United States, and very importantly, your voting power. White wanted this to be determined by cash, US dollars, gold, and securities. The British, who had no money or were bankrupt, wanted it to be determined entirely by your share of international trade. That is, the British had no money, but they traded a hell of a lot with their colonies and dominions, so that's how they wanted it to be determined. Needless to say, the Americans would have nothing to do with that. The United States was insistent that both the IMF and the World Bank be headquartered in the United States. In order not to piss off Keynes too much at Bretton Woods, though they didn't tell him that they wanted it to be in DC. They left that for the following spring, right before the institutions were formally inaugurated. The British believed that Washington, D.C. had too much political significance. So the British proposal was basically that the world should be divided between the Americans and the British. There would be a London headquarters for half the world and a New York headquarters for the other half. And the Americans said it's a non-starter. Congress will never permit it. It has to be in the US. But the most interesting question, which wasn't discussed at Bretton Woods at all, is who would be the head of these institutions? Now, for those of you who know a little bit about the IMF and the World Bank, this makes no sense. I mean, I've been telling you this story about how the Americans are creating these institutions to dominate the world, and the IMF has always been run by a European. And the World Bank, which was not important at all to the Americans, is run by an American. How on earth did this happen? And this is how I started to become a Cold War historian. This story is unbelievable. Don't take my word for it. Here we are. January of 1946, President Truman nominates Harry Dexter White to be the first US executive director of the IMF. And he's going to nominate him to be the managing director, the head of the IMF. But then this man gets wind of it. Recognize him? FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And he is appalled and prepares a long 70-page memorandum for President Truman saying, don't even think about it. I can prove that Harry Dexter White is a Soviet agent. How is this possible? This is the man who is a staunch American economic nationalist, wants to enthrone the dollar. Spoiler alert, if you don't want to know the answer, you should head out now. The Soviets never classified him as an agent. He was what was known as a blind asset. He was very important to the Soviets, at least as important as Alger Hiss, I would argue more important. For years, he advocated for the Soviets in important policy discussions in Washington. He protected Treasury officials who were charged with inappropriate activities on the behalf of the Soviets, officials who were absolutely guilty. He provided them with classified information, really quite remarkable. I won't spend too much time on it now. We can go into it in questions, but how do you explain it? White was he was not a communist, but he was very pro-Soviet, like Henry Wallace, who I'm writing about now, believed that the Russian Revolution was a great liberating event in human history. He was a hyper New Dealer in the sense, like Henry Wallace, he believed that the world should be run by enlightened technocrats, American technocrats, of course, like him, and he was enamored of Soviet economic planning. And he believed passionately that the world was moving in that direction and that the United States had to move forward into this new world in close alliance with the Soviets. And he believed that it was the Republican isolationists who were the ones who were being harmful to true American national interest. He would never have acknowledged that he crossed the line. Just to give you a little fast forward, how did this all end? He was called before a grand jury in 1948. He probably couldn't have been prosecuted because if you read the transcripts, it's quite clear the FBI was tapping his phones and that wasn't admissible in court. But he did voluntarily go before the House Un-American Activities Committee, where he really bested almost all the congressmen there, except one, 35-year-old congressman named Richard Nixon, who was absolutely forensic and set him up for a perjury charge, kept asking him, do you know Whittaker Chambers? Whittaker Chambers had been a Soviet spy. He was White's first handler back in the 1930s, and White kept saying, I don't recall, I don't recall, I don't recall. 2 days after the hearings, he has a heart attack and dies. So that's what happened. So back to President Truman. He doesn't believe Hoover, but he knows he has a huge political problem on his hands because if he goes forward with the managing director nomination, Hoover's going to leak this and there's going to be a political problem. his Treasury Secretary, his Secretary of State, they want White out. They don't like this guy. They don't trust this guy. They don't care if Hoover's right or not. They want him gone. But Truman is too political for this. He said that's going to create problems. He says, I can quarantine him as U.S. Executive Director. I just won't go through with the Managing Director nomination. But now the Americans have to craft a narrative to take to the world. What are they going to do? Who's going to be the managing director? If Truman tries to appoint somebody else, everybody's going to ask, but this guy created the IMF. Why are you overlooking him? What do you know that you're not telling us? So in March of 1946, when the IMF is inaugurated at Savannah, Keynes is shocked. The Treasury Secretary comes to him and explains that we've decided after due consideration that in order to secure the confidence of the American investment community, we want presidency of the World Bank. And it would be ungracious of the United States to take the presidency of both institutions so the IMF can be run by a European. This completely shocked Keynes, and they never knew why. But to this day, the IMF continues to be run by a European. Why? To cover up a spy scandal. That's the only reason. The IMF was far more important to the United States than the World Bank, but in order to cover up the spy scandal, Truman felt that this is what he had to do. Really quite remarkable story. So back to the economics momentarily. Was Bretton Woods actually a success? Generally, when we learn about Bretton Woods at school, we're told that the 25 years from 1946 to 1971, the Bretton Woods era is a golden era in economic history, and this was all due to Bretton Woods. It's really nothing of the case. The IMF and the World Bank were virtually moribund during the 1950s. Currencies remained inconvertible. Western Europe was devastated by the war. They didn't have the resources to begin trading again. They didn't have dollars. They didn't have gold. So the role that was supposed to have been played by the Marshall Plan, by the IMF and the World Bank, was instead played by the Marshall Plan, which was a massive grant system rather than a loan system. Interestingly enough, it's not until 1961 that the first 9 European countries meet the convertibility requirements of the IMF's Articles of Agreement. By that time, the system is already coming under enormous strain as the US is losing gold reserves. The French and others are demanding their gold back because they don't trust Harry Dexter White's promise that the Americans would always be able to exchange dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. And of course, they were correct. Fast forward to today, we're still living in a world where the US currency is dominant, despite the fact that after World War II, we accounted for more than half the world's output. Today, it's less than a quarter, but the US dollar is still dominant. Quite interesting, I had done a book tour in China back in, I guess it was about 2015, and the book is sold better in Chinese than in English. And do you know why? It's really quite fascinating. What's the story of Bretton Woods historically? Well, Bretton Woods is a deal between the world's largest international creditor nation, the United States, and the world's largest international debtor nation, Great Britain. Well, who's the largest international debtor nation today? The United States. Who's the world's largest international creditor nation today? China. The Chinese see this as a narrative about them. They are the Americans of the 1940s, and we are the British of the 1940s. We are the declining ex-imperial power. At least that's how they see it. It's helped my book sales, so I shouldn't complain. It doesn't hold water. there's a huge difference between China and the US today, and Britain and the United States in the 1940s. Go back, for example, to 1956 and the Suez Crisis, when Ike is furious at the British and threatens to create a crisis by denying Britain IMF assistance. The United States could afford to trigger a sterling crisis at no cost to itself because US holdings of British securities were trivial, amounting to about $1 per US resident. Today, Chinese holdings of American securities amount to over $1,000 per Chinese resident. If the Chinese tried to create a dollar crisis in order to punish us, they would be hurting themselves at least as much as they would be hurting us. But basically, there is no deal to be done on the monetary front between the United States and China today. There was a deal to be done in the 1940s between the US and Britain. It was a very imbalanced deal, but it was a deal nonetheless. So the notion that we could get a new Bretton Woods today is, to my mind, nonsensical from a political perspective. There is simply no deal to be done right now. That's not to say that the international monetary system couldn't be improved, but just not through a political process. There is no deal to be done today. So what is the greatest threat in the world today to the dominant position of the US dollar? And we do benefit enormously from that position. When we borrow money, we borrow in our own currency. When we talk about developing countries, for example, getting into crisis, what does that mean? It means they borrow dollars, and then their currency depreciates and they can't pay back. We never have to worry about that, because when we borrow money, and we borrow a lot of it, we borrow in our own currency, which we can print and pay back with the stuff that we print. Also, we can punish countries that do things that we don't like by imposing massive financial sanctions on them. We can cut off their access to the international banking system. Look what we did to Russia after the Ukraine crisis. But the only thing I would point out here, and I think that's very important, that this is something like overusing a powerful antibiotic. If you overuse an antibiotic, what you do is you encourage the bacteria to mutate and produce strains that are resistant to the antibiotic. And we are slowly but surely convincing the world that they need to mutate the international economic system. And China and Russia, not surprisingly, are seriously investigating new ways to conduct international transactions without having to use the US dollar. It's difficult. It's more costly. But if we make it more costly to rely on the US dollars, alternatives, like, for example, barter, trading in gold or oil, become more attractive. Right now, many of you may have read that we're talking about seizing hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's foreign exchange reserves in order to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine. It's a great idea in the abstract. I mean, Russia is an aggressor. It caused many hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. Why shouldn't they pay for it? They should pay for it. The problem is that if we cross that line and show the world that at any point we can, if we don't like what you've done, irrespective of our reasons for doing it, we can seize your dollars. And the thing that truly underpins the dollar and compels countries to save in US dollars is the belief that they can always use those dollars to buy valuable assets, not only in the United States, but abroad. If we undermine that confidence, we will encourage alternative transaction mechanisms in the international monetary sphere that will weaken our ability to use the dollar both for our own economic benefit and our political benefits. So it's a cautionary tale. Right now, we've had tremendous benefits from what was produced at Bretton Woods, and we have to be careful that we preserve it, particularly as our place in the international economic hierarchy continues to decline on a relative basis. There's no doubt that going forward, countries like China, even if they make significant mistakes, will become more significant economically. So we need to protect this precious legacy of Bretton Woods. With that, I'll stop and be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
My first question to Ben is, did Bretton Woods have any effect on the thought of the United Nations?
It was part of a wider program. The United Nations, of course, was meant to replace the League of Nations. But the United States was convinced that it needed both a political approach to international cooperation and an economic approach, specifically because of the example of the 1930s. I should emphasize, I mean, it's quite obvious that the UN did not evolve precisely as FDR had hoped. You can argue that the world is better off that we have it than not, but it became a forum not for cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, but for horrific confrontation. Likewise, the IMF today would be unrecognizable to the founders at Bretton Woods, to either Harry Dexter White or to John Maynard Keynes. Neither of them ever envisioned the IMF being sort of some sort of international firefighter. In other words, that you would go to the IMF in crisis. The IMF was just supposed to grease the wheels of a fixed exchange rate system. If a country truly got into difficulties, it was expected to fend for itself by devaluing its currency with permission from the IMF, but that's how it would deal with it. And if that wasn't enough, that was your own problem, you're on your own. And you could say, well, how could they have been so naive? Because countries are always getting into financial crises. But neither Keynes nor White was in favor of free capital flows. They were both very much against it and believed that free capital flows would lead to crises. So the IMF that exists today is a very different one than had been envisioned at Bretton Woods, just like the United Nations is a very different institution than FDR had envisioned.
In the last 2 or 3 days, I read an article in the paper about the movement away from the dollar silver basis to cryptocurrency. And I'm wondering what that means, because cryptocurrency would make the dollar completely artificial. Would make the dollar completely artificial in value. What's your opinion about that act?
Moving away from the dollar to cryptocurrency.
Oh, okay. Cryptocurrency has obviously certain advantages, particularly in international transactions. It's in principle much less costly to transact. It also doesn't rely on one potential node of failure. It's a decentralized system. But as we're seeing, there are significant flaws in private cryptocurrency. If you take a currency like Bitcoin, it's obviously extremely volatile against the US dollar. And to the extent that most of us have to conduct most of our transactions in US dollars, this isn't particularly convenient. Now, obviously, many entrepreneurs working in the crypto space noticed this and decided to address the problem by creating quote-unquote stable coins. So this obviously had an attraction. You can use our currency which is less costly for transactions, particularly across borders, but it will always maintain its value against the US dollar. And as we've seen, those promises are not credible. There are two basic ways to do it. One is through a so-called algorithmic approach, which is only as good as the math underlying it. And remember, those who launch these things want to be able to make a profit from it. So they're not doing this as a public service. That, as we learned, doesn't work. The other is to hold reserves against the cryptocurrency, and that costs the provider money. So obviously, they want to hold as little reserves as possible. And at the first whiff of suspicion that the provider of a stable currency is not actually able to provide those US dollars at a one-to-one exchange rate, you get a complete panic with everyone running for the exit. So to me, the more interesting question is whether state-based cryptocurrencies have an important role to play. And China, of course, is investing massively in this particular area. Now, they've presented it to the world as a way in which to internationalize the Chinese currency, the RMB, but it's not so far showing any significant signs of doing that. It is mainly a valuable mechanism for the CCP to maintain internal social control within China, because if you use China's state cryptocurrency, the government can monitor every movement in your life. And so this is an extremely valuable control mechanism for an authoritarian regime. And this is one of the questions that the Fed and the Congress are wrestling with right now in terms of the possibility of digitizing the US dollar and going in the same direction. Will that give the government too much control over our personal lives? This is a serious issue.
Got two questions. First, after the U.S. went off or closed the gold window, didn't Kissinger go to Saudi Arabia and say we want to have the sale of oil pegged to the dollar, therefore becoming the petrodollar? And Saudi Arabia is being approached by China and Russia to go to the BRICS system, and it sounds like they're seriously considering that, and a number of other countries, again, India and some other countries are also looking at doing that. Would that undo the Bretton Woods framework? And then the second is China's Belt and Road the equivalent of their Bretton Woods, where they basically enslave a lot of these third world countries to China?
Okay. A lot of good questions in there. With regard to Kissinger, I don't know the answer to that, whether Kissinger specifically did that. I do know that, of course, the Saudis did threaten to start trading oil in other currencies, and they're talking about doing it again today, possibly, and for example, in RMB. The question then becomes, however, do you really want to hold RMB as a store of value long term? I mean, the value of holding a dollar is pretty clear, that you have reasonable confidence as a non-American abroad, that at some point in the future, you'll always be able to go into the United States, at least inside the United States, and buy up valuable assets, and you will have clear property rights to those assets. The Chinese can't offer you the same bargain. If you're holding RMB, you really can't have great confidence that, say, in 10 years' time, it's going to maintain roughly its purchasing power, and you are going to be able to go into China and buy up private assets and have genuine control over that asset. And so that's a big problem for China or any other state provider of currency that wants to compete with the US dollar. The most obvious alternative to the dollar would be the euro. But the euro, as we learned during the great financial crisis, is constantly on the verge of an existential crisis. In other words, we wonder, will it still exist in 10 years' time? And Mario Draghi appeared to have put an end to that argument by announcing famously, we will do what it takes. But here we are again with the yield on Italian sovereign debt beginning to take off, and people asking whether the ECB is going to maintain its commitment to support Italian debt. So the euro doesn't offer the same degree of comfort as the US dollar. Now, with regard to China's Belt and Road, that's more of a direct competitor to the World Bank. I mean, China is now the dominant international development lender. It is far more significant than the World Bank. But when you think, I was always extremely skeptical about the logic of Belt and Road. Remember what we were told, that there are all these massive investment needs in developing nations, so this is some sort of free lunch. You know, China has all this excess capacity, all these hundreds of trillions of dollars in reserves, so it can finance this. But if this were some sort of free lunch, why didn't the private sector do it already? It's quite clear that if these countries are accepting financing from China and not from the private sector, it's because China is underpricing the risk. And as fast forward to today, and it's clear that Belt and Road has been coming undone. Countries are increasingly defaulting or on the verge of default and renegotiating terms with China. Although I don't believe it was China's intention to use Belt and Road as a means of becoming a colonial power, in other words, seizing assets abroad, it has done that. Sri Lanka borrowed many billions of dollars to build port facilities in Sri Lanka, defaulted, and China took over those ports on a 99-year lease, and they can use that for military purposes, for its navy. So it's something we need to be concerned about. Whether China intended to engage in debt diplomacy is debatable, but they're at the stage where we have to be extremely concerned about countries becoming dependent on China. Now, I'm concerned about our own government trying to compete with China at its own game by stepping away from the World Bank and making our own underpriced bilateral loans abroad. And if you stop to think about what we achieved at Bretton Woods, it's also really stupid. Why wouldn't we use the World Bank? Why wouldn't we use the World Bank? We're the only ones with veto power at the World Bank, meaning nothing can happen at the World Bank without our approval, yet we get the rest of the world to finance it. It's absolutely insane for us to move to a system of bilateral development aid when we effectively control the World Bank. And I'm often get concerned that Congress doesn't really understand this. We motivated the creation of the BRICS Bank, for example, under the Obama administration, when the Republican Congress blocked governance reform at the World Bank and the IMF, which would have given the Chinese slightly more voting power, but at the expense of the old European powers, not at our expense. So we could have looked very gracious by immediately signing on to this reform. The only ones who would have been pissed off would be the Europeans, and we would have taken away from China the argument that the Americans are unreasonable. We have to create competing institutions like the the BRICS Bank. Because look, the Americans won't even allow commonsensical governance reform at the Bretton Woods institution. So sometimes I think we shoot ourselves in the foot by not realizing that the value of what we created in the 1940s is actually higher for us today than it was in the 1940s. If we tried to create an IMF or World Bank today in which we arrogated to ourselves sole veto power, the world would laugh at us. They couldn't do that in the 1940s. So it should be a priority of ours to maintain these institutions and to continue to support them.
I'd like to strap on the historian hat for a few minutes here. You mentioned there may have been dubious circumstances surrounding Harry Dexter White's death in 1948, right after his appearance in front of J. Edgar Hoover. What's the academic consensus on that, and what more kind of speculations can you draw? Like, what do you think?
There was a lot of speculation, naturally, for example, that the Soviets had bumped him off, or that he escaped to some country in Latin America, but there's not the slightest shred of evidence supporting any of it. White had multiple heart attacks in the years running up to his death in 1948, so it's not particularly surprising that the House Un-American Activities Committee testimony would have put more strain on his heart. There is, to the best of my ability to discern, there are no suspicious circumstances there. He really did die of natural causes.
I had a question.
Sure.
Isn't China sort of sowing the seeds of its own destruction because of its population disparities, its elderly leadership, and its...
Good thing we don't have elderly leadership in the United States.
I know. That's why I keep saying we gotta fight. We're like the Soviet Union in the early '80s. Nothing against octogenarians, but don't accuse me of being ageist. But we need to get the younger crowd in. But anyway, so do you see China's? Are they going to try to project more power, even though their power is fading at home?
Well,
and such?
with regard to their demographic problem, they've recognized that they have
Yes.
a very severe
They're letting people have 2 children.
Exactly, which is why they've abandoned the one-child policy, and really, quite fascinatingly, it's not made a difference. The population continues to decline. So China does have a major demographic problem going forward. It is almost mathematically impossible for China to continue to produce 6% growth rates. I mean, the only way they can do it is by creating ever larger debt levels, which are eventually going to produce a major financial crisis. Now, Belt and Road was to some extent China's attempt, so far not successful, to basically export its problems. It had built up massive overcapacity within the country. We're seeing it particularly in the property sector. And they didn't want these firms, for example, these construction firms, to retrench. So they said, okay, well, we'll send them out abroad. So when China lends billions of dollars to a country to finance a construction project, they write into the contract that they must use Chinese labor, Chinese contractors. But then, of course, in order to pursue this policy, they wind up underpricing the risks. So China continues to create new crises to correct the problems of previous crises that the country has created. I mean, basically, China has hit the same growth wall that Japan hit decades ago. It's a typical sort of middle income trap. When countries get from, move from the low income category to the middle income category, it becomes impossible to sustain those sort of growth rates. And going forward, China's real growth rate, I would say over the next 10 years, is going to be somewhere on the order of 0 to 2%. They can continue to overbuild, but it's only going to be at the cost of increasing already unsustainable debt levels.
This is sort of a World War II question. So the idea the federal government poured, billions and billions of dollars into building the infrastructural war during World War II. Why didn't that create greater inflation and all of that going on in the United States, especially even like in the post-war period? Is it because of the money, because it was circulating through the businesses and paying the soldiers, but why didn't it? I mean, we're all worried about inflation right now, and they always blame it on the infrastructure bill or something like that. What made World War II work?
Well, we did have very significant inflation in 1946, and it had been entirely anticipated because during the war we had price controls and rationing, and there was a big debate between the Truman administration and Congress about whether to sustain the price controls. Truman did roll them back slowly, and quite naturally, when the controls were taken off, there was a big one-time jump in prices. Nonetheless, the United States really did quite a remarkable job reintegrating the soldiers coming back from Europe and Asia into the private economy. Part of that was helped by sending soldiers to college. In other words, we didn't expect them just to come back to the United States and get jobs at a grocery store. We educated them and prepared them for better positions within the labor force at a time when we really couldn't absorb them productively. So, we made policy mistakes, no doubt, in the immediate post-war period. But broadly speaking, we did quite a remarkable job reconfiguring the U.S. economy from wartime to peacetime production.
When you talked about the attenders for Bretton Woods, I think you said there were about 150 countries represented, or how many?
Okay, can you put up your hand, whoever you're talking? Okay.
Yeah.
In the shadows.
I guess my question is, what about the smaller countries like in Latin America and other countries? What was their participation in Bretton Woods, and how did it affect them?
Latin American countries did participate, and they did have significant influence, in particular on the creation of the World Bank. The World Bank was initially supposed to be an institution dedicated to reconstruction of Western Europe, and the Latin Americans basically said, "What the hell? What's in it for me? Why should we provide our valuable dollars to an institutional that's going to bail out the Europeans?" So the concept was widened. It would not just be a reconstruction institution, it would also become a development institution, and that was mainly due to the influence of the Latin Americans. Now, some Latin American countries had other agendas in the monetary sphere which were less successful. For example, the Mexicans, not surprisingly, wanted silver to be an important monetary metal. And the American delegation made clear to them that we can put in some ambiguous words so that you can go home with a winning narrative, but it's not going to happen. So if you look at the final articles of agreement, the only valuable monetary assets were going to be gold and US dollars. And we could credibly say at the time that dollars were valuable because of the fact that we had so much gold. It's hard to get our mindset adjusted to that period, but in the 1940s, people around the world did genuinely see gold as being the foundation of money. And paper monies were just either more or less credible vouchers for gold. The only reason that the pound sterling still played a significant international reserve role in the 1940s was because their currency was inconvertible within the sterling zone. Among their colonies and dominions, you had to trade in sterling. So that was it. I mean, the only competitor to the dollar was sterling, and that's why we forced the British to make it convertible.
Was there any residue from our own bimetallism problems in the Progressive
That's a
era?
new
When
term.
my bimetallism?
Bimetallism.
Well, we remember in the Progressive era, you had William Jennings Bryan wanting to make the dollar, in gold and silver. Was there still a prejudice in the 1940s against anything like that?
There wasn't a prejudice. There was an incident which I describe in the book where some American silver industry representative managed to sneak into the conference, and he was literally dragged out of it. But
Okay, was he quoting William Jennings Bryan, Cross of Gold, Street?
No, it was at that point. It was much more about business. I mean, this is good for the silver industry, and it would be good for the nation, not from a populist perspective, but it would allow us, in principle, more flexibility in the operation of the monetary system. But I didn't really see any evidence of anybody reviving that. Certainly the Roosevelt administration had no interest in it.
Well, they would have remembered, especially certain gentlemen of a certain age and back then would have remembered those fights.
True. But we were already having fights with the Chinese and others about silver. China had been on a silver standard in the 1930s. So by the end of the 1930s, those fights had really been exhausted in the United States.
Doctor, I have a question for you. With the construct of the G8, now the G7, are there topics in consideration with the IMF and the World Bank when those global economies meet?
You do see forums held in these institutions looking at the broad question of so-called digital currencies, right? Whether state-based or private, but they're really just talking shops because nobody's seriously talking about doing this at the supranational level. I mean, the United States wouldn't allow it, China wouldn't allow it. So the debate is primarily a domestic one. The Fed is seriously doing investigations into digitalizing the dollar. It would have enormous implications for our banking sector. Because if we wanted to take it to its logical conclusion, we wouldn't need banks, right? At the point where we all have digital access to an account at the Fed, why do we need banks? So it's not surprising that the banking industry is strongly against it. Finding some sort of workable accommodation that allows us to get the economic benefits of a digital currency without taking the cost in terms of eliminating valuable competition and the innovation that comes with it, and without undermining legitimate privacy considerations. These are very difficult questions, and I expect there to be, going forward, you will see a lot more politically difficult testimony involving the Fed chair in Congress, because these questions are going to become front and center.
Well, would the American people really want to have the government that intrusive into their lives?
It's a very good question.
I mean, I know a lot of people that will not give up their fiat currency. They don't want the intrusion of cryptocurrency, or if we digitize everything, that's too much of the big brother looking down on us.
Mm-hmm.
And Americans have always fought against those types of things.
Well, yeah,
Or a
and
certain segment of
remember the whole ethos of the development of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies was very much a pushback against the state. Before I wrote Bretton Woods, my previous book was a book called Money Markets and Sovereignty, which was sort of a big think book about the history of money and its difficult relationship with the concept of national sovereignty. And what you see throughout history is this fascinating dialectic where currency initially develops privately. So we need means to transact with other people whom we don't know and we don't trust, right? So what sort of things make good currencies? Well, gold is pretty good because it's very durable. It doesn't change its composition over time. You can't radically increase the supply from year to year. It only goes up a few percent per year. So it's got a lot of the characteristics that make it a good currency. But what happens when a given commodity becomes a valuable currency, states or aspiring dictators take it over.
Nationalize it, whatever.
They nationalize it. What they would do what's called clipping it, in other words, undermining the value of it, adding base metals in order to devalue it. This is where inflation comes from. They overtax, and then you see a pushback from the private sector. People move into other currencies. We see that today, for example, in Latin America, El Salvador, Panama, Ecuador, are all completely dollarized. They have no currency anymore. And that's because the people spoke. They said, we will not use the state currency anymore because you keep undermining it. So Ecuador, even under a radically anti-American leader, continued to operate with the US dollar as its currency. So you see this endless dialectic playing out over time as the public and the state keep grasping, struggling.
Bretton Woods was very successful, but were there any shortcomings? Were there any failures? Things that they failed to do at Bretton Woods?
Shortcomings of Bretton Woods, any failures that they didn't
Of
move towards.
Bretton Woods? Well, let's imagine what the world would have been without a Bretton Woods. Again, remember, the IMF and the World Bank were, as I said, moribund throughout most of the 1950s. So it was part of Roosevelt's one world vision, and it was completely untenable. It was replaced by Truman's two world vision, and that was a different set of institutions. So the Marshall Plan actually played the role that the IMF and the World Bank were supposed to play. And then NATO became essentially the military escort for the Marshall Plan. So Bretton Woods per se was not successful. The US dollar was was always going to be dominant, even though it helped that we enshrined its special position in the IMF's Articles of Agreement. But even to revive trade in Europe under the Marshall Plan, we needed US dollars. So the United States, for example, to get European countries to trade with each other, financed something called the European Payments Mechanism, which survived from 1950 to 1958. The US underpinned the system with $350 million and basically guaranteed all cross-border trade in Europe. For example, no one would trade with Germany because Germany had so many creditors that if you sold something to Germany, you were just another creditor at the bottom of the list. So the United States wiped out Germany's debts, internal and external, and said if you export to Germany, the United States will guarantee the payments. And there were no defaults under the European Payment Mechanism. It was extremely successful, but it could never have been without the US dollar underpinning the system. So it was the Truman two-world vision that was ultimately successful rather than the FDR one-world vision as manifested in the IMF and the World Bank.
Support for this program is provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org.